For my first wear and weathering effects, I'm going to be using a watercolour pencil. In this case the 10016, which is quite a light colour. Because the real colour paints have a matte finish, the pigment from these watercolour pencils stay on the model perfectly. The idea is to create this sort of very fine paint chipping effect, especially along the lines on the fuselage, the panel lines, and more intensely towards the front of the model. As you can see, I'm creating small chips in the paint while following the lines of rivets, the panel lines here, and above all at the front of my model. I'll do the same thing as before now, but this time using a darker colour, the 10019, to create some more effects. I want to create the paint chips along the rivet lines, the areas in relief, and on the inside of the panels to create scratch marks and paint imperfections. The contrast between the darker chips and the lighter chips is already giving more volume to these effects. The last colour I'll use is this aluminium, the 10033, and these will be the last paint chip effects I make, and especially on the inside of the panels and focusing on the panel and rivet lines above all. Be careful not to go over the top when creating this sort of effect. You do need to bear in mind though that when you varnish your model, about 50% of the effects you create will be lost. However, around 40% or 30% of them will return when you apply a matte varnish. Now it's time for a different kind of wear effect. To start with, I'm going to use a third generation paint that is the same colour as my base coat, the olive drab. Pour out just a drop, hardly any at all, and then take a small piece of sponge and soak up as much as you can of that paint. You want to make sure it gets into every pore of the sponge. Get it nice and wet, and then dab the sponge on your glove. You can see here the kind of texture it's creating. I will then dab that sponge on the model like this at 90 degrees to create this kind of very fine chipping effect and make it look like the paint has worn away to reveal the base coat underneath. I'm only going to do this on the top sections of my stripes. And the more you apply, the greater the wear effect is going to be. Then, using the same colour as before, the third generation olive drab colour, my next step is going to be to take a very fine brush and increase the size of some of those chipping effects. It doesn't matter if you accidentally leave a large drop of paint, because it will eventually dry completely flat. What I'm trying to do here is make the chipping effect a little more dense to blend in that chipping effect I created with the sponge during the previous step. Next, my last step to integrate the wear on my invasion stripes will be to use a colour, in this case a chipping colour, the 10019, and just on the top of the model, on the top of the fuselage here, on the ridge coming from the tail empennage, I'm going to add some of that colour. And now, with this sort of flat synthetic bristle number 2 brush, I want to dip it in some water, remove any excess on a napkin or some paper, and then start to blend in that colour as if the pigment was an oil. You can see here how everything is starting to blend together nicely. I want to make this sort of downward brush strokes, and I'll do the same on the black, although it is less noticeable. All my previous chipping effects are starting to blend in with the pigment from the watercolour pencil now. And while all the pigment is still fresh, I'm going to take an old, thicker, dry brush, and without dipping it in water this time, I'm going to brush together all the pigments to create some texture. Here you can see the end result after all the work I did with the watercolour pencils. You can see the various paint chips and scratch marks, the wear I have achieved around the engine for example, and especially in the nose area, in this area here, on the front of the engines and near where the wings join the fuselage. There's a little around the door, but never anything on the main fuselage or on the top. Now is the time to seal everything with a gloss varnish, and I'll obviously use some thinner. I need to shake the mix to ensure the components blend together and it's ready to be applied. So let's go. Pick up your model and you can see how the varnish causes the watercolour pencil effects to lose a little intensity when it's applied. You can see that I've only applied very little, and yet that intensity has faded. You can see here the difference between the unvarnished area and the area I've already varnished. That's why I like to make very obvious effects, because you're going to lose around 50% of that intensity when you apply the varnish. As you can see, the pencil effects have faded about 40%, but you can also see that they have been fully integrated into the model now. Look at that fine finish and shine you get from the product once it's dry. Now that I have a shine all over my model, I'm going to apply some washes. In this case, a dark wash, a dark brown, and a lighter wash, this dark grey. And I will complement these two with a very light, almost white, grey colour for the darker areas. Now I need to prepare a little bit of white spirit separately for application in the area. I'll put my white spirit here. I dip my brush in the white spirit, then in the product and back in the white spirit, and I let the product flow along all the panel lines to fill in all the rivet holes. This is what it looks like when I'm done. Now I'll do the same thing, the brush in the white spirit, then in the dark grey, back in the white spirit, and I only want to apply the product, this dark grey, on the white invasion stripes. Again, you can see how it flows into all the panel lines and rivet holes. Finally, I'll clean my brush before doing the same again, but on the black stripes. I'll dip the brush in the white spirit and apply it to just a few of the rivet lines, just a few of the rivet lines here. You can see how the product is filling in all the rivets and all the panel lines. Each colour for a different shade. Now I'm going to carry on with the rest of the model. And this is what the wing looks like after I've finished applying the product. Okay? Now, with a piece of paper or a rag and moving in small circular motions, you want to gradually remove the excess product. As I rub the surface and remove it, you can see that all the rivet lines and all the panel lines have been nicely highlighted. You can see that right there. After applying the decals, which you can see here, my next step is to apply the oils. So I'm going to take two colours, this ochre and buff, Using a brush on the front and top of my model, I'll just apply a couple of small drops to the front edge of each panel. Now I'll add some light with the lighter colour in these areas here. You can see that I'm applying very little. Now with a dry synthetic bristle brush, I'm going to gradually blend in the oils. You can see what I'm doing. Small dabs so that the two oil colours blend together nicely. And I'm using a dry brush for this. No white spirit at all. And I'm only doing it on the front of the model and on the engines. Also on the front of the engines. Now this is the final look of my model after applying a final coat of matte varnish. This is it here, a third generation matte varnish diluted at 50% with its corresponding thinner. Can you see how the completely matte finish is perfect? And this is the final result of the now finished model. You can see the final effect of the real colour paints and the varnishes. Some extra details like the crates I put inside to add a bit of life to the interior. And of course you can see the finish, which is what I like the most. It has a completely matte finish, although with a tiny splash of shine. That's why I like the third generation matte varnish so much, to be honest. For this here, for the antennas, I used this kind of elastic thread. Highly recommendable. Now all that's left for me to do is insert the second wing into its place, and that's the model finished, as you can see here. Well, I hope you liked this video and enjoyed watching me paint this model. Goodbye for now.